Alhamdulillah wahdahu, amma ba'd. Under the subtitle, Models Testing Our Imagination, Dawkins goes on to say, there is a less familiar way in which a scientist can work out what is real when our five senses cannot detect it directly. This is through the use of a model of what might be going on, which can then be tested. We then work out, often by doing mathematical calculation, what we ought to see or hear, etc., often with the help of measuring instruments, if the model were true. We then check whether that is what we actually do see. The model might literally be a replica made out of wood or plastic, or it might be a piece of mathematics on paper, or it might be a simulation in a computer. We look carefully at the model and predict what we ought to see or hear, etc., if the model were correct. Then we look to see whether the predictions are right or wrong. If they are right, this increases our confidence that the model really does represent reality. We then go on to devise further experiments, perhaps refining the model to test the findings further and confirm them. If our predictions are wrong, we reject the model or modify it and try again. End of quote. Now, this may seem to be such a beautiful, endearing image of what a model is and of the epistemic warrant it provides, that for a layperson it would seem to be all we need to do to learn anything of any worth about reality at large, about all there is in existence, or at least all that exists of a certain kind, which happens to be the subject matter of the model. Remember, before we proceed any further, that Dawkins starts by presenting all of reality as the subject matter of science. If it is real, whatever it is, then science must be the only proper way to learn anything true about it. This metaphysical tenet of naturalism is so deeply rooted in Western practice of science that much serious work should be done under what academics would call the philosophy of science to show that. Okay, no philosopher of science will have done that work in the manner we are doing here, because they were all trained and educated on the Greek legacy of what is to be a philosopher, of what it is to be a philosopher and to do philosophy. They all believe, one way or another, that no ontological issue is out of reach of human reasoning, and that a theory is, by definition, the philosopher's effort to provide an account of existence as it is, to reveal existence as it is. Western philosophy of science, just like all other branches of philosophy, only came to become an academic discipline under this overarching work ethic. Under this overarching work ethic, they all share. Such ethic that presupposes the belief that all of reality is game for theory. You might be of a school that observes limits to the scientific endeavor with respect to things that exist in reality, but that would be only in favor of another practice of theory that should address whatever parts of reality science cannot, or science leaves out, in your view, namely metaphysics. The Greek distinction between physics and metaphysics in terms of what a theorist does is actually little more than a semantic exercise. If by metaphysics they mean things that lie beyond our senses, like abstract knowledge about existence itself, then their science, back then, was indeed a purely metaphysical practice. When you propose a theory that teaches that if something is sensible to humans, then it must be made of so and so, then you are proposing an analogy between particular types of things that you observe and every observable thing in reality. So you could end up with a definition of reality itself, or at least observable reality, claiming that it can only be so and so. Okay? The same thing was done with abstract meanings like motion, change, time, and the like. A theory that describes the nature or composition of anything in existence, or at least anything that can be rightly described as observable, or as physical, or as real, or as existing in time, etc. This is a theory of metaphysics, and yet this is and has always been the way that philosophers theorize about the so-called physical world. In other words, the way they do science. Historically speaking, the distinction between physics and metaphysics was purely an educational vehicle or educational device for students of philosophy to start from the study of astronomy first, medicine and mathematics, basically, and then proceed to deeper and more profound questions in their study. In reality, though, metaphysics is a Greek tradition in doing theory in general, be it about the observable or beyond. All right? Now, thanks to that quasi-religious scholastic commitment to metaphysical investigation in the ancient Greek tradition, philosophers of science are all riding the bandwagon today, so to speak, without ever stopping to pose questions that challenge that overarching commitment itself. It never even occurs to them, or to any of them, that this might be where it all went wrong originally. None of them would ever find the sociological ecosystem that would inspire them to go that way. There would be no motive, there would be no reason for them to think that way. Once a discipline is settled in as an academy, a pedagogical institution, as has been the case with the Greek academy itself in ancient times, the very questions that one can or cannot bring up in that academy are readily defined or outlined, okay, for those who work there. Going further, the academy would only develop to fine-tune those basic questions, to deduce more questions from them, to refine them, or sophisticate them somehow, and theories and proposed answers would sprout from those grounds, not from any other. And once the practice in the academy is disciplined within those bounds, those general bounds of epistemic commitment, it is inconceivable that one who seeks to become a student of that academy should propose a challenge to those basic questions. Okay? From the very principle of asking them at all. Okay? You shouldn't be telling them, oh no guys, you shouldn't even be bothered with asking this or that question at all, because it shouldn't be asked, because it shouldn't be, it's put up to investigation in any theoretical sense. But that would not be allowed, because the academy would have already been founded upon posing this question and debating about it. Okay. Now, philosophers like to think that they are immune to that problem. Okay, that they couldn't possibly fall under the invisible influence of some ancient thinkers or schools of thought, one way or another, without even being able to notice that or to think hard enough to realize that. However, that's precisely where they are all wrong. All right, the very belief that everything is inherently subject to rational investigation by means of analogy, deduction, induction, and abduction, and that nothing should be kept out of the reach of human reason in this sense, is an article of faith. Okay, in and of itself, that a philosopher wouldn't dare to challenge without bothering with some rational argumentation and thereby defeating his challenge before it even comes out. Okay? You're not a philosopher if you don't ascribe to this hidden doctrine one way or another. The belief that one needs a theory about knowledge itself in order to be justified in knowing anything at all, and the belief that we are justified in inquiring about what reality is as such, what existence is, and how it happens, and that we are required to draw a distinction between what is real and what is not, based on somebody's theory on the matter. This is the driving force for all of philosophy, thanks to the ancient Greeks who founded the tradition. This, however, is by all means an outrage that they wouldn't even begin to see as such. How could they? I mean, they're all connected to the same matrix, so to speak. A theory is, thus, universal by the very definition of a theory, irrespective of its subject matter, as irrespective of its subject matter, as implicitly adopted since the times of the Greeks. By universal here, I mean in the metaphysical sense, not that it has to be about the entire universe. Whatever that they define that to be, I mean that if the subject matter of the theory, whatever it is, does exist in reality, or even potentially exists wherever or whenever, then the theory applies to it by force of necessity, by the very definition of what a theory does. Okay, things fall under the theory by the very merit of their existence. The Greek notion of categorizing all things that exist in categories according to their composition presupposes the implicit belief that the human mind can acquire knowledge about everything that exists outside of it through reasoning and intuition alone. The general idea is that in order for something to exist at all, then it should be analogizable to observable things in certain aspects and manners that the theory proposes as an explanation for its very being. Consider, for example, a counterfactual that says an object exists because it is composed of X and Y, and that without this very composition it would not be there, it would not exist. As in the theory of substance and essence, for example, the famous Greek theory. Only substances that have essences built into them in whatever way would exist, because otherwise you wouldn't even be able to describe something as being existent. to begin with. And if it is to be given a certain attribute, then by virtue of the very meaning of that attribute, it should be described by the analogy provided by the theory, which explains the way that this attribute or property manifests in anything that exists at all. It is describable by this attribute, whatever it is, because according to the theory, it is built of such and such. So the theory explains it's being described by this attribute. It's being worthy of this attribute. Something is in time, for example, because it is composed of such and such. Something moves because it is described in some physical analogy as such and such. Something is in space with respect to other things because it is composed of such and such. Okay, another leap of metaphysical theory would be to attempt to define time and space themselves as physical entities that exist outside of the mind rather than abstract meanings that describe certain relations or states of affairs that have to hold true of anything that exists at all. If something can be described as existing outside of the mind, then it follows necessarily that it either existed in the past and no longer does, or it exists now, or it will exist in the future. Or it exists in the past eternally and in the present and in the future for forever. Okay, that's the final, the last option here. This is no metaphysical proposition to describe something as existing in time. It's merely an elaboration of what it means for something to exist at all. The same is true of space and place. It must be relatable in terms of place to other things that exist outside of the mind as well, one way or another, because otherwise you could only say it is nowhere at all, which gives the exact same meaning as non-existent. If it's nowhere at all, then it doesn't exist. If it is somewhere, then it has to be describable by differentiation in terms of place. It is above it, it is below it, it is next to it, is something like that, okay? Something in this sense. However, thanks to the Greek tradition underlying the practice of Western theory, no physicist would be satisfied with what they do if they did not start by providing metaphysical definitions of what time and space are. Okay, that is, giving some arbitrary analogy to observable things to explain the nature of both time and space, as though they were describing the attributes of things that exist outside of the mind. Newton committed that fallacy of projection, in his characterization of space and time to some degree, and so did Einstein later on, although he did it to a much larger extent. Einstein. Space and time and relativity are literally the explanation of the phenomenon of gravitation itself, when in fact it's a profound error in reasoning to turn the abstract meanings of space and time, which are the attributes of being up, down, front, back, left or right relative to something else, and the attribute of happening before something else or after it or simultaneous to it, into physical things that exist outside of the mind and do in fact affect physical entities and the way that they move or behave. Thanks to the metaphysical tradition that defines the very practice of philosophy in Western Academy, this striking fallacy is reduced to nothing more than a philosophical debate between two groups of philosophers. One that would choose to treat those two meanings as physical entities, substantivalists, and another that would choose to treat them as abstract mental relations, or the relationists. All right, whatever you think or believe, you would eventually end up earning an ism of your own and engage in futile debates characterized by fundamental sophistry with those who carry the opposing ism. That's what the tradition does to you. All right. Following that tradition of metaphysical sophistry, the notion of a physical model is used not to mean a simple mental pattern that simulates a particular group of regularities within the scope of our actual experience with those regularities, but rather to mean a supposedly perfect match to reality, ontologically, in all aspects that relate to those regularities one way or another. In other words, if X seems to be a fitting model to a particular aspect of a certain type of existing physical things within the scope of accumulated sensory experience, that is, then we are justified ipso facto in deducing other aspects and attributes to X from that model by reverse analogy, as though the model was actually a thorough description of X. Okay, not a limited analogy that is only known to match it in the patterns exhibited by particular regularities. All right. We imagine, says Dawkins, or you might say, we guess what might be there that is called a model. Well, that's absolutely true, I say. We do guess it. However, what is it that we end up with, even after it is tested and shown to still provide proper simulation of reality or agreement with reality, all things considered? It still remains to be a guess, all the same. Okay? A successful guess, a helpful guess, but a guess, nothing more. Okay, the mathematical patterns of which continue to only guess the metaphysical patterns of which continue to simulate the actual regularities in question to a satisfactory extent even after repeated testing. That's what it will continue to be. Okay, he goes on to say, we then work out, often by doing mathematical calculations, what we ought to see or hear, etc. if the model were true. We then check whether that is what we actually do see. If the prediction, are right, this increases our confidence that the model really does represent reality. Okay, at which point we have to pause and ask him, what exactly do you mean by if the model were true? Okay, by true, one is supposed to believe nothing more than the fact that the analogy works in simulating that particular aspect of the phenomenon in question. Okay, we should then say the model does look like the reality of the particular subject matter it is devised to simulate for all intents and purposes, and thus it helps us predict it. Okay, we should not believe that whatever we can extract from the model by any means of deduction or calculation must hold true about the actual phenomenon in question, just because this match actually exists. Even an equation as simple as F equals ma has its limits in simulating reality. This is Newton's law of force and acceleration. It's not a complex model that has to reduce and overlook countless factors and causal processes in favor of particular variables that the modeler needs to learn about. It's simply a mathematical simulation for the observed particular proportionality between force and acceleration on one hand and force and mass on the other. Performing a simple calculation, I could predict now that when the mass reaches, say, 10 to the power 25 kilograms, as in the current estimate of Neptune's mass, for example, and we wish to move that object at a speed close to the speed of light, then we need to exert an astronomical amount of force for that to happen. You can calculate that force, you can predict that amount, in the same manner as we can calculate smaller forces that the simulation works perfectly well in predicting and that we use in our daily life. However, is it really possible to move a planet by force at any speed at all? The model will tell you that it is possible. It seems to match reality in the sense that whenever you insert any figure, any quantity for its variables, it will work. It will give you the number. Okay, but does that imply that this actually makes sense? That this actually represents reality? Okay, is it really possible to move a planet by force at any speed at all? You would only claim that it is theoretically possible. You would only claim, and listen to this, you would only claim that it is theoretically possible since the model does provide you with some mathematical value if you have no bounds whatever in your belief system to limit the very applicability of the equation to reality. If it matches reality in as much as actual experience has shown thus far, then you are justified in believing that it matches reality everywhere, at any time, and at any possible values that those variables could take, at least in theory. Now, this is what the Greek tradition of metaphysics teaches, and it's what it does to you as a theorist. It culminates essentially in methodological naturalism, since by nature we usually mean those patterns we regularly observe in this part of the world that we humans inhabit. So if indeed everything is analogizable by virtue of its very existence to the natural, so defined, then it follows that methodological naturalism is actually the inevitable spawn of the Greek tradition in doing theory. The initial assumption of the applicability of human reason is learning about everything that exists. The initial assumption of the applicability of human reason in learning about everything that exists, whatever it is, does imply an underlying presupposition that only the natural does exist. Okay, it's not clear to me because we're only going to be using some type of analogy one way or another to learn that. It's not clear to me how one could say which of the two dispositions emerged first historically, the metaphysical tradition of theorization or the underlying belief that nature is all there is. Okay, or naturalism, so to speak. They are both methodological implications or perhaps characterizations of what the Greeks have been doing since the founding of the academy. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah did go a long way in exposing the shortcomings of the Greek tradition of metaphysical thought in his refutations of the philosophers and mutakallimin of his time. His scathing criticism of Aristotelian logic, for one, shows just how vividly clear it was to him where the problem really lied. how vividly clear it was to him where the problem really lied. Every fallacy of projection he noted, every case of denying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the proper meanings of his attributes as understood by the Salaf, following a theoretical commitment to what the meaning supposedly implies in anything it is attributed to, every case of inferring false philosophical rules from the premise of a cosmological argument, some cosmological argument like the rules that if things start to exist in something or in attribution to something, then that thing itself must have started to exist. ما تحل به الحوادث فهو حادث كما يسمونها. And thereby performing a categorically unwarranted reinterpretation of scripture. Every case of such fallacies and more, brilliantly identified and characterized by the Shaykh rahimahullah, does in fact follow inexorably from the metaphysical tradition of theorizing about existence qua existence, to use Aristotle's own words. Okay, it's why the Salaf were clear and adamant in rejecting the very practice of kalam altogether, not just particular sects of mutakallimin, as the Ash'ari would have you believe. Had he been alive today, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, I am positive that he would show with equal rigor and precision just how far the tradition has damaged the sciences of today. Okay, if the predictions are right, this increases our confidence that the model really does represent reality, says Dawkins. Now, this is a fundamentally false characterization of the epistemic warrant provided by the model, whatever its scientific subject matter is. One that presupposes that the model or the theory is universal by the very merit of the theorist being able to match it with reality, one way or another. It's universal not just in agreeing with the particular regularity it is devised to simulate under whatever conditions, in any place or at any time. It's universal, or rather metaphysical, to use the proper term here, in the sense that it should be expected to match reality in every aspect, such that anything we wish to learn about reality that relates one way or another to the main regularities that are matched with the certain phenomenon the model is built to simulate, we should be able to learn it from the model itself, by mathematical entailment, by inference from the model, as though we were physically examining the real world, right? And I'll give different example to that later on. This is so because the theorist did not build the model with the clear understanding that this is only a metaphor or an analogy to reality, one that helps the theorist produce a mathematical pattern that matches the observable regularities in question, and that there is no epistemic warrant whatsoever in supposing that it must match it in every other aspect besides the particular regularities being directly simulated by the model. Rather, they built it with the implicit belief that the theory can and in fact should be perfectly identical to the real world in every conceivable respect, ontologically speaking. This is why Einstein's paradigm was hailed as a revolution against that of Newton, because either you believe that the reality or ontology of what gravity is, as conceived by Newton, is the truth, or you reject it in favor of Einstein's ontology. On the other hand, gravity is either the effect of an invisible cable that pulls bodies to each other in what amounts to be an intrinsic property inherent in every physical body by virtue of its mass, one that depends in its magnitude on the masses of the bodies and their spatial proximity alone, or it's the effect of an all-encompassing substance that is the physical manifestation of what we call time and what we call space, as it bends the paths of moving objects and light beams under the influence of their masses. Okay, it could either be this in reality or that, or neither. But obviously it cannot be both. Fact of the matter is, however, there is no knowing what gravity really is through observation or reasoning. Newton has only shown that his metaphor or analogy for it does produce a mathematical pattern that matches the observable pattern to a great extent, which it still does, obviously, which is why people still use it today. He didn't, by entailment, prove or show that the reality of gravitation is as such ontologically. It just doesn't follow, okay? The matching does not imply that. However, he, like every other natural philosopher in the Western tradition, was trained to believe that a theory is a metaphysical vehicle to revealing the complete truth of reality, as in Plato's famous allegory of the cave. If anything at all exists in reality, then the theory should have something profound to say about it. Otherwise, why bother? A philosopher would think that way. If the function of a theory is to teach us about reality qua reality or existence qua existence, to provide us with knowledge that ultimately grounds our understanding of what this world is all about and why we are in it, to eventually elucidate our existential status in a manner so profound that it leaves us in no need for revelation to fill that void for us, religious revelation, then it is not nearly enough to view it as a mere analogy for what's really going on. No, people have to believe that it is much more than that. It has to be the case that the more matching up to reality we achieve in the theoretical model, the more reason we have to believe that the underlying ontology of the theory is the truth of what's really going on. Why? Because the philosopher needs to convince himself and his followers that he has indeed figured it all out, that nothing could exist in reality without the theory telling us at least potentially what it can or cannot be like. Okay, the job of a philosopher, natural or otherwise, has been established in the very founding of the academy in pre-Socratic times as the one who brings the light of truth about all that exists to those who are too blind to see it on their own. All right? When Copernicus revolted against Ptolemaic astronomy, the argument was simply that his analogy or his mathematical model of the heavens, his mathematical metaphor of it, analogizing the status of the earth in relation to the sun and the stars to a system where the sun is stationary and everything else revolves around it in circles, was much easier than Ptolemy's model, where the same reality was matched to a system where the earth was stationary at the center of it all. The reasoning goes as such. It's easier and more fitting, then it must be true, ontologically speaking, as opposed to the other model. Okay? No observation was made or could ever be made to determine what the actual ontology of this relationship really, of this rotation relationship really is. You can easily interpret everything to fit either way. You could easily select an arbitrary center for all rotations anywhere of your choosing and rebuild the model to work accordingly with varying degrees of geometrical ease or difficulty that have nothing to do with the actual reality of what's going on. Okay, you could well construct a lunocentric model for that matter if you're so inclined, one where the celestial bodies and the earth rotate all around the moon. However, just the fact that you can build a model and match it with reality in a satisfactory manner or to a satisfactory extent and find ease in drawing useful predictions from it, that fact doesn't have any bearing on the actual ontology of what's going on. Right? It only helps us represent the relation of rotation in different manners, in different ways. Okay? The exact same relation is represented in different manners in different ways by selecting the center arbitrarily. We can do that and we can end up with the same result. You're merely constructing a mental metaphor that simulates the observed reality to varying degrees of success in terms of applicability, I mean. You're not discovering what's really going on, okay? You're just selecting the most feasible metaphor, the most easily applicable and the most easily used metaphor in this case. If we Muslims didn't know any better, if we didn't have any warrant from scripture or from innate intuition, we would have no choice but to say that it could easily be the case that the earth is nothing but an insignificant rock in the grand scheme of things, trapped in orbit around an insignificant star among billions of other stars in one of billions of galaxies floating around in a universe that has its center so far away from us we couldn't even begin to imagine where it is. As is currently believed in the Western Academy, just as easily as it could be the case that the Earth is stationary at the geometrical center of the universe with everything revolving around it like the people from the Middle Ages used to believe 1,000 years ago. The situation then epistemically would be that of total indetermination by observation with no sensible grounds to apply any probabilistic reasoning in determining which of the two ontologies is the truth. Just because one mathematical model of our making seems easier, instrumentally speaking, than another in representing what we observe, and that alone does not warrant the acceptance of one of the two ontologies as real and the rejection of the other. Obviously, you have to observe both the Earth and the very edge of the universe simultaneously at the same time in a single view if you wish to determine whether or not it is actually stationary at the center of the universe while everything else is revolving around it, or if it is in fact just a speck of dust revolving far away from the center as Copernicus would have you believe. As far as I know, nobody has ever made such an observation. Copernicus obviously didn't, and there's no making it at all. actually. The point I'm making here is not that Earth is actually stationary at the center of the universe. I'm arguing that there is actually no epistemic warrant for the leap of faith that Copernicus took when he argued that the reality of the situation was actually heliocentric rather than geocentric. All right? Astronomers of the 16th and 17th century had no warrant to challenge the ontological belief long held by the Church on those grounds alone. Okay? There was none back then, there is none today, and there will never be any. So how did he make the leap, and why did it so easily find acceptance and prevalence in the Western Academy in less than a century, mind you, despite this fact? The reason, brothers and sisters, is the unfortunate Greek tradition of metaphysical theorization under which all theorists have been trained in the Academy ever since its founding fathers set it all up 30 centuries ago. The job of the astronomer, according to the Greeks, is not just to give us a simulation that helps us predict the locations of celestial bodies at different future times. No. Greek astronomers sought to do much more than that. They endeavored to reveal the truth about what's really going on up there. They were, of course, influenced by certain religious cosmologies floating around at the time about what planets really were, how they moved, what the firmaments of the heavens were like, etc. However, the academic ethic was that of using reason and reason alone to determine the truth about all such things, about all such issues, all such questions that ancient cosmologies discussed or adopted or had to say. The theory in this sense was constructed to be an actual revelation, okay, a rational revelation done in the mind of the theorist to reveal the complete truth and expose it just as the eye sees what is there to observe. It is not proposed as a partially fitting analogy, that one that works for all intents and purposes, or selected arbitrarily for instrumental ends, that is, with only as much validity as the actual experience gives it. Rather, it is revealed by the mind, or perhaps captured from some transcendental world of forms, as believed by Plato. And if indeed it is revealed in this sense, then every instance of matching between the epistemic model, the theory, and reality would only be viewed as additional confirmation for that revelation, and additional reason to be confident, to use Dawkins' words, that it is indeed true, that they hit the mark, claiming it. The classic allegory of the elephant and the blind men does a very good job in showing how presumptuous this Greek attitude to theory really is, and we will be expanding on it as you will see. Imagine a group of blind men standing around an elephant. One of them holds its tail, and says, "This must be a rope hanging from the ceiling." He proceeds to construct a model in his mind of ropes as they wave around and respond to his handling, and proceeds to predict what he should expect to feel with his hands the next time he moves it to the left or to the right. So far, so good. The model seems to work just fine. The calculations tell him what to expect within the limited scope of his sensory observation to a satisfying degree. Okay? Now imagine that by pure chance, he did 100 different tests to confirm his rope theory and only to find it to work in every single instance. Okay, now would he be justified in believing that this is actually a rope? Would any of those men be justified in believing that what's in his hand is really a rope? The answer is no. Why? Because he did not observe all there is to observe, if one is to make such a judgment about what's really there. Okay? If it feels like a rope in his hand, then it could well be a rope. Okay, of course. But that's all he's justified in saying. It might be a rope. His mind did not reveal to him that it actually is a rope, just because the analogy he selected arbitrarily helped to match every instance of limited observation he has managed to afford so far. The metaphysical tradition of theory, however, teaches him to believe that it is indeed a rope, and that if it wasn't actually a rope, then it would be inconceivable, or at least unlikely, that the model would fit or match reality in every instance in such a way. He is thus justified in believing that it is indeed a rope until something happens to make him drop that theory in favor of another. Okay, now let's assume that the elephant suddenly chooses to move its tail after hundreds of instances of the blind man moving it around as though it was just a rope hanging from above. At this point, and according to tradition, he is required to either modify the theory and add an agent who holds the rope from above, moving it around on occasion, and thereby would probably find himself forced to add a few more equations to determine what to expect when indeed the rope is moved this way or that way. However, at this point, another blind man might come up with a new paradigm altogether, another brilliant revelation, so to speak. one where the original metaphor is shifted to another one altogether. Maybe, he suggests, it wasn't a rope at all. Perhaps it's a snake. Okay, this new theory would explain everything that the rope theory does, in addition to some observations that the other would only explain by means of some additional hypotheses that are not quite welcome. Okay, the idea then that someone is toying around with those poor blind fellows, waving the rope around from above without them being able to detect him except by sensing that the rope is actually being moved, that's quite a spooky assumption, I would say. Of course, the idea of it being a snake is potentially far more scary, since if true, then it seems that they're probably going to be bitten any minute now, to get bitten by the snake. But if they have spent enough time handling that thing around without getting bitten, then they might find that reason enough to reject the snake theory altogether. Or someone might suggest it to be a weak snake that is not, or feeble snake that is not in a status where it could actually harm them or bite them. In that case, perhaps it's being hung up from its head or something. Who knows? Okay. In that case, the theory will be more favorable than that of the man holding the rope, because again, we don't wish to propose something that causes us to panic unless we really have to. Obviously, they would be applying some form of abductive reasoning in the process of coming up with explanatory hypotheses as such, applying the so-called Occam's razor in dismissing unwelcome hypotheses. You see, the proper reason to dismiss a hypothesis under the burden of its ontological baggage is if indeed our previous experience tells us that it is much less often or less frequently the case that this be the explanation in similar cases. That would be the probabilistic reasoning or probabilistic footing underlying the decision to dismiss a certain hypothesis as unlikely ontology. However, in this case, the theorist is blind, and the sense of touch is the only way he has to observe what is actually going on. From previous experience, he could propose the rope and the snake. Okay, let's suppose that the previous experience happened to him back when he had his eyesight, when he could still see, and so he's starting to propose according to that, to hypothesize according to that. Okay. Perhaps he has no previous experience of holding an elephant's tail at all, or he does, but he detects no reason to explain the situation as such. Okay, so all things considered, he really has no warrant in dismissing any theory on the grounds of abduction or inference to best explanation, no rational grounds to apply the so-called Occam's razor, if indeed its application is taken to, or the principle of parsimony, if indeed its application is taken to be construed as I explained it before, that you think or consider if there really is any reason from previous experience that you have had before to suggest that a theory is too complex to be true, or too complicated to be true, or it's not likely to have happened with so much detail, it's not likely to have happened with so many entities being proposed to explain how it actually unfolded or how it actually happened. If you do have previous experience in this manner, then yeah, you're justified in rejecting it being so complex, rejecting the theory being so heavy in ontological assumption or so. Okay, but otherwise you don't have any grounds, you don't have any footings to use this method. Okay, to call it parsimonious, just because the theory is parsimonious or more economic in terms of hypothesis, then it must be true. No, there's no logical commitment. There is no rational rule that tells us that. There isn't. There simply isn't. All right. So he opts, that blind theorist of ours, to dismiss the hypothesis he finds unwelcome for reasons that cannot be justified at all in reality. The problem all arises, as you can see, from the blind man insisting, thanks to the Greek tradition, on revealing the reality of what is actually going on there, despite the fact that he knows he cannot acquire the necessary observation and induction to do so. Okay. He refuses to admit that he can only go as far as maintain a proper analogy that helps him predict what he would feel the next time he touches another part of that thing in his hand, or the next time he moves it around, or the next time it moves not due to his will, I mean. He insists on telling the other blind people around him that he knows that this is actually a rope. Okay, the theory must do that. The theory must enable him to do that. Okay, he seeks to acquire a more profound revelation of truth to teach them. Okay, because that's what they came to the academy to learn. He refuses to admit that he's a blind man, just as blind as the rest of them. Okay, he wishes to outreach to beyond his eyesight and tell you that this is the reality of what's really there. So what started as a suggestion or as an arbitrary selection or selected construct of his imagination becomes the truth of what's really there, just because they all wish to believe it to be so. All right? They go to him to teach him the truth. The model thus continues to undergo modifications and alterations on the very same initial analogy, not because they wish to make it fit better for practical purposes, while still believing it to be just an analogy, but because they wish to assert that this is what's really going on in reality. They wish for the metaphor, for the analogy to actually match reality perfectly. Okay, ontologically speaking, they wish to believe that with so little observation at hand, they could, in fact, make such profound revelations about the unobservable that leave us in no need to actually see it with our own eyes, or more importantly, to learn about it from what is claimed to be the teachings of a prophet sent by the Creator himself. Okay? The Greek philosopher did what he did on the implicit belief that metaphysical theory can, in fact, circumvent the need to follow those who claim to be teaching irrefutable knowledge revealed by the Creator of the world. They engaged in debates with religious leaders of the time just to show lay people that the truth, the fundamental truth about what is real, is not to be obtained from those people, but from the mental revelation that the philosopher brings to his students. After all, can't you see how good their mathematics works in predicting things that have not yet come to pass? Did you not bear witness to the validity of their astronomical calculations and their mathematical applications in your daily life? There must be then some transcendental reality that reveals itself to those enlightened beings, the philosophers, that is far more useful to you than the stuff that religious leaders teach you. Okay, such is how the academy was built 30 centuries ago. Follow me if you wish to have the truth of all things revealed to you in a manner that doesn't leave you in ultimate submission to divine forces that you are not even convinced they do exist. Forces that, according to the pagan beliefs of the time, were little more than a bunch of evil, lustful, indecent, and indifferent superhumans residing above the clouds. Okay? If the philosopher can indeed obtain the light of wisdom and knowledge of all there is to know, potentially at least, without having to submit to those supposed despicable beings in the heavens, then by all means this must be the way to do. Then by all means this must be the way to go, right? This is how the Western Academy was founded. The demand to supplant the religions of the time and present an alternate source of revealed knowledge to take its place has been the driving force from the very start. We go to the philosopher to teach us about the truth of all things. This world, what we observe, that we observe, and whatever is there beyond it, if at all. That's the function of theory in principle, of what the philosophy produces to you. And what the philosophers produces to you. That's the reason why today physics insists on trying to combine all those and theories in one single equation that predicts all and tells all there is to tell about reality, the so-called theory of everything. Einstein devised his special theory of relativity with the incentive to combine the Galilean principle of relativity and the Maxwell laws of electromechanics. Why? Because apparently it wasn't enough to just have those two separate sets of laws without showing them to be related to each other under one fundamental system that explains why they both are the way they are. Okay? And then again, why not add gravity to the mix somehow? Why not unify gravity with acceleration under the metaphysics of special relativity on the nature of both space and time? To construct one major framework that explains and relates all those phenomena in a single elegant mathematical formula. Okay? And then, why not venture further in the unification endeavor and inject the laws of the very small quantum mechanics in the mix to finally have the single most fundamental theory of everything? Okay? Of course, he died without coming up with such a formalism, but his dream is still pretty much alive. And now, physicists are running in circles trying to come up with a way to combine two fundamentally different types of mathematical expression: the topological nonlinear equations of general relativity, the field equations, and the linear probabilistic estimates of quantum mechanics in a single theory. Why? Not because we need to, or because we wouldn't be able to make good use of what we already know about the regularities of physics any otherwise, but because the Greek tradition of theory teaches that a theory is supposed to be much more than just an instrument of utility. and the response to practical demands. It should teach us, the humans, how to respond to all fundamental questions about reality, about what exists out there or can exist out there, to reveal the fundamental nature of reality qua reality. Okay? After all, we cannot settle with those separate theories and laws we've come up with thus far, only giving us distinct, disparate glimpses of what's really out there. We didn't start this discipline of theory 30 centuries ago just to learn glimpses of reality, but to learn about everything. Okay, that was the subject matter from the start. That's why someone like Stephen Hawking, for example, could easily get away with writing a book under the outrageous title, A Brief History of Time. A history of all time. Okay, anything that could have possibly existed in time, or perhaps, or happened in time, the theory the book presents is required as a matter of purpose for the theory, function of that theory itself, to tell you something about it one way or another. Okay, that's the seat that philosophers have occupied in epistemic authority ever since the inception of the Greek Academy. Only today, those of them who now call themselves scientists are the ones taking the lead. All right, they do call themselves scientists, although they are in fact every bit as metaphysical in their commitments as the Greek philosophers of old. The underlying assumption under the entire enterprise of unification in physics is founded upon the implicit belief that a theory is indeed describing the actual ontology of whatever there is, not just a metaphor representing a proper simulation for certain patterns and regularities with an ontology that could in fact only look like reality, nothing more. If we decide that what John, for example, holding in his hand, let's call him John, is indeed a rope, when in fact it's the elephant's tail, and what Peter, say, is resting his back against is a wall, the elephant's torso, then we can construct a model of a wall on which a rope is hanging free, formalize it mathematically, and thereby unify two theories under one all-encompassing model, all-encompassing model that not only helps us predict what is happening next, but also reveals to us what is really there ontologically, which has always been the primary function of theory since the ancient Greeks anyway. But we know for a fact that this doesn't in any way bring us closer to the true ontology of what we are examining. If anything, it takes us further. Indeed, in physics, the quest has gone so far as to plunge reality into so-called higher dimensions, which are indeed nothing but a baseless analogy to the three dimensions of motion and extension that do, in fact, satisfy every rationally possible description of relative direction there can be. Something either above you, below you, on your right-hand side, or on your left-hand side, behind you or in front of you, or in any derivable direction from those six. Okay. There is no room, rationally speaking, for other directions that cannot be described by those six or their derivatives. Okay. Yet, some mathematicians, under the influence of the same tradition of metaphysical analogy, chose to redefine the so-called dimension of space to mean a degree of freedom for extension and motion in reality. Another fallacy of projection, where just as it became imaginable following that analogy for something to exist in reality in just one dimension or just two dimensions, it also became conceivable, in the realm of rational possibility at least, for something to exist in more than three dimensions. Four dimensions, 5 dimensions, n dimensions, as they would call it. Thanks to that tradition, it is not even remotely clear to a mathematician, not to mention a physicist, in what sense this is actually a fallacy of projection. Okay, where dimensions, which are actually nothing more than relational statements of relative location, are taken for real boundaries of space that define and restrict the actual status of existence of things in reality. And now we have a quantum gravitation theory that describes reality in an imaginary space that has nothing to do whatsoever with reality at all. Nothing at all. Okay, it simply it seems like it could include all of reality as we know it in it, but it really helps with nothing. And while every sensible physicist does admit that this is a fatal flaw in the theory, none of them can actually identify the real reason why it is so, or where that deep fundamental defect is in the very way they do theory comes from. It's worth noting that Dawkins writes as a subtitle in conclusion to this lecture, it's worth noting That Dawkins writes as a subtitle for this part, models testing our imagination, and yet he fails to realize that it is basically and fundamentally our imagination that comes out in these models, building on some analogy from our limited experience with the world, and that beyond the area of agreement between that analogy and what we actually observe in the phenomenon in question, there can be no warrant for anything. Beyond the part of the rope theory where we can predict what will happen to the thing in our hand, whatever it really is, when we tilt it this way or that way, which happens to a tail pretty much like it happens to a thick rope, that is, there's no telling beyond that, through observation, if indeed the ontology is true, okay, if it really is a rope. So the part of our imaginary model that we actually test is in fact a very limited part that does not in any way tell us whether or not the entire picture that we needed to draw in our minds in order to build the model is true.